Welcome, everybody. I love the way that you fell to silence. That's very, very impressive. Really lovely to see everyone, and welcome to the first of our lectures from Martin in his capacity as the FETL Professor of Leadership in Further Education and Skills. Now, we're delighted that the Further Education Trust for Leadership has sponsored this post with us. The lectures and the post provide an opportunity to celebrate further education, its institutions, its workforce and its students, and we hope to strengthen its hand. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we do hope that this will be really as much a dialogue as a lecture. Following Martin's presentation, we'll have a response from Dame Ruth Silver in her capacity as founding president of FETL, and then there'll be time for question and answers. First, the usual little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who like to tweet, you'll find the Wi-Fi login instructions on posters around the hall, and the Twitter hashtag is #DefiningFurtherEd. All one word, so #DefiningFurtherEd. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, please do take the doors behind you and our fire marshals will guide you out onto Bedford Way or round to the back of the building, or if necessary, out to the fire doors at the side and upper floor so that we can exit from the back of the building. So, without further ado, to the lecture itself. I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Martin Doel. As many of you here will know, prior to joining the IOE in 2016, Martin spent 8 years as Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges, and prior to that held leadership roles in the RAF. His final appointment with the Armed Forces was as Director of Training and Education for all 3 of the armed services, working in the Ministry of Defence, the largest employer of apprentices in the UK. At the IOE, Martin has the luxury of more time and space to reflect on the further education sector. His focus is on the distinctive contribution that FE can make to, of course, individual well-being and futures, but also to national prosperity. And his attention is on the leadership challenges facing further education providers of all kinds. In this first lecture, Martin will be helping us to step back from the day-to-day challenges of the sector to reflect on the shape and scope of the sector and the journey taken in policy terms to get there, and to think about how FE institutions relate to their localities. So, over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Becky. Well, first of all, welcome, and thank you very much for coming out this evening. And first, though, to allay any misconceptions there might be about the title of my lecture this evening, I'm not asking if further education matters tonight. What I'm actually rather asking is if the way in which further education is defined and the way it has been characterised matters. My basic thesis will be that it does matter, the way in which it's defined and has been defined, and that the way in which it's been defined and is being defined has consequences that are damaging for the way in which policy is made that affects further education and its students, for the way in which it's regarded outside the sector, so how the rest, those outside the further education regard it, and for the way in which the sector regards itself. But I will then argue, somewhat counterintuitively, that further education is incapable of being defined in a singular way that would redress the damaging consequences that I'll have identified. The alternative, I'll suggest, is to see further education as a system of systems, or even better, a complex ecosystem that constantly changes, but which comprises some strong and distinct subsystems or subsectors. And perhaps even more importantly, that further education providers of all kinds, and particularly their governing bodies, directors or trustees, should give much closer attention to defining their fundamental purpose of their organisation and the distinctive contribution that it makes to the social ecosystem within which it works. In coming to these conclusions, I'll be drawing upon experiences, Becky explained, of 3.5 careers, I'd call it. First as a teacher, in fact, then as a leader in the Royal Air Force, then as Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges, representing and supporting further education colleges, and finally, the career that I've most lately embarked upon here at the Institute. And in respect to that latest career, I should say at the outset, I think, how very grateful I am, first to FETL for having funded the chair of Leadership in Further Education and Skills at the Institute, and then to the Institute itself and Becky for having the confidence in me to be its first incumbent. As well as experience from each of my careers, I'll also be taking and using intellectual tools from each of those domains: military leadership, educational theory, and how you represent policy to government, and then combining it with study here and reflection that I've had since I've been in post at the Institute for Education. I should also say that in testing, I'll be testing my thesis that I'll be explaining to you this evening in research that I'm about to embark upon with Dr. Susan Cousin, a colleague at the Institute, examining how purpose and values are determined in colleges and other further education providers. I'll be organising my remarks in 4 main sections. First, looking at how further education has been defined since the term first came into use in 1917. Then I'll be looking at the consequences that arise from the ways in which it's been defined from 1917 until now. And finally, further looking at the alternatives we might have in different manners in which further education might be defined. And finally, some concluding remarks. So I start with a historical perspective, and I divided up that history of further education. This is not all the elements of further education, they extend much further back, into 3 phases. And I've called them first the early years from 1917 to 1943, then from 1944, the landmark Education Act after the war, through into 1992, which I've called adolescence, a period of rapid but inconsistent growth. And then finally, in the words actually used by my colleagues Ken Spores and Anne Hodgson in their publication, recording the first 25 years since incorporation of colleges as the coming of age of further education. So looking then at where we find the definition of further education. The first time I've actually come across, or I've been able to find further education, is in the 1917 Draft Board of Education Regulations. Those regulations, though, were not enacted until 1926 and were primarily concerned with post-school education. Previous reports and reviews prior to 1917, such as the influential 1906 report on technical education, referred instead separately to the constituent elements of what might now be considered further education. That is, juvenile education, as it was called then, successively aged 14 to 16 and then 16 to 18, adult education and technical education, all identified separately. Indeed, the Spence report of 1938, which provided much of the detailed reasoning for the subsequent landmark 1944 Education Act, makes no mention that I could find of further education, referring instead to upper secondary technical education. The separation of roles in the prehistory to further education was reflected in the institutional landscape of the early 20th century, encompassing distinctive and differentiated adult education institutes, working men's colleges, technical colleges, and continuation schools. As Bill Bailey notes in his excellent history of further education up until 1990, the early history and development of further education featured a large degree of voluntarism, both from students and from local authorities, with no compulsions on students to attend or upon local authorities to make further education provision. As an aside, reading through these early reports and reviews, I was struck by 2 significant impressions, aside from the fact that actually it was more expensive to access them when they were written than it is now on the internet. At first, it was a sense of ennui, or as Bill Murray might have said, Groundhog Day, with many of the policy issues that we continue to grapple with today being addressed early in the last century. And secondly, each of the reports comprised a comprehensive history of developments up until that point. They were also conducted at a stately pace. The Spence report, for instance, spanned 7 years of review. As I note later, this stands in clear distinction in relation to the frequency of recent reviews and reports and the lack of attention given to policy history in memory in each of those reports. But returning to Bailey's point, the laissez-faire approach of central government in relation to further education maintained until the 1944 Education Act. Local variable influence was only substantially replaced by national oversight in the late 1980s and with the incorporation of colleges in 1992. The 1944 Act provides the first substantive definition of further education by listing and classifying its tasks. Interestingly, classified as secret. I'm not entirely sure about the plans for further education after the war. Would have lost us the war if they got into the German hands. But this definition, if it can be recorded as such, or regarded as such, is merely a collecting together of functions that don't fit within university or school education, which is a theme to which I'll be returning. The years from 1944 saw substantial growth in further education, both in the number of students served and the range of functions encompassed within the description and beyond this description here. They included meeting the needs of young adults with special educational needs, serving the needs of the unemployed, access courses for adult students seeking university entry, higher technical education in the form of HNDs and HNCs, and most lately, the substantial task of providing maths and English tuition to young people who have not yet reached the GCSE benchmark standards by age 16. But this growth was uneven as it was episodic. With local authority control of colleges, they developed in a highly heterogeneous way up until incorporation, as determined by varying levels of local investment and commitment, and through an early wave of institutional consolidation as the formerly separate adult education institutes and colleges and technical colleges began to merge into larger institutions. National attention in the meantime was focused on qualifications, national training boards, or higher technical education, most notably in the formation of colleges of advanced technology in 1956 and the establishment of polytechnics in the 1960s. The demise of the 11 Plus in the 1970s had an incidental but important consequence for further education, one that I lived through in my own education, with the reorganisation of 16 to 18 education in many parts of the country. Whilst in some parts of the country, like Hampshire, where I was brought up, a distinction was made between colleges providing academic and those colleges providing vocational education. In others, the reorganisation brought into being tertiary colleges that covered the full gamut of 16 to 18 education in a single institution, one that also often made provision for adult learners and community education, as well as A-levels. So we get to 1992, the equivalent of FE's year zero, when in some senses the only history that exists beyond that point is actually verbal history and passed down by generations rather than written and recorded. This was the year that colleges became incorporated and were removed from local authority control. Our return to what I consider to be the unfulfilled promise of incorporation in relation to the exercise of autonomy in further education in my closing section. But at this point, it's important to recognise the consequences of a related development, the introduction of national funding methodologies by the newly established Further Education Funding Council, the FEFC. I'm reticent to use the neoliberal label here that gets used in nearly every lecture you go to at the Institute of Education, not least because I'm not sure it had been fully invented at this point or understood as it is now. But the change of funding methodology did change behaviour, as has been well described by Alison Wolfe in her EPI publication, Remaking Tertiary Education. It induced intended as well as unintended consequences. Competition between colleges intensified. no doubt being intended as a means of increasing standards. It also prompted a further round of consolidation in the number of colleges, becoming in the process each of those colleges still more general and with an increasing number of roles. The latest round of mergers that's much spoken about is an acceleration, but since 1992 there's been a consistent process of consolidation of colleges within England. At the same time, the further education descriptor began to encompass large numbers of independent training providers, ITPs, who were both for-profit and not-for-profit organisations. The source of funding for independent training providers initially came by way of Training and Enterprise Councils, TECs, reflecting their predominant role, the independent training providers, in delivering work-based training. But in a way that was probably unintended, colleges sought, in a market, to also draw down funding from TECs, and competition between colleges and independent training providers intensified to an extent not seen elsewhere in the UK. Since 1992, we've seen a continuation of the same direction of travel in England, with the institutional funding landscape becoming ever more fluid and uncertain, reflected in the fact that almost every subsequent review of further education or FE colleges would start with a refrain that FE was fragmentary, complex, and difficult to understand. And if you look at the lead into each of these reports, the Foster Report of 2005, Alison Wolf's Review of Vocational Education in 2011, and the Lingfield Report into Professionalism in Further Education in 2012, they all start with that same refrain. Despite that, actually, the definition of further education has remained remarkably consistent, and the Wikipedia description today is as it has been all the way throughout. Education, in addition to that, receiving a secondary school that is distinct from higher education offered in universities. This is the theme, my first theme in the evening. The definition has been consistent from 1917, that FE is defined by what it is not by what it is. It's defined as education that's not in a school or a university. But what is not delivered in a school or a university has grown in its range and extent between 1917 and today. And this is a definition that's not a definition at all. It's a catch-all for administrative convenience. This catch-all approach and lack of distinctive identity within it has had consequences and continues to have consequences. And the first, overall, of those is a lack of singular identity and of an agency within the sector, which has further consequences affecting each of these groups. First, policymakers and how policy is made. It affects how the sector is seen by wider stakeholders, and it affects the way staff and leaders in the sector see themselves. And looking at those consequences, I've gone to a range of sources, and I've picked on a number of them, but the themes, I would say to you, are consistent and general amongst all of the sources. The first source I've gone to is the Institute for Government last year, which used FE as one of its 3 case studies in exploring why Britain, particularly, is so prone to policy reinvention. The other 2 case studies were regional government and industrial strategy. In the case of FE, which is a term they use inconsistently in the report, most often conflating it with only one of its roles, technical and professional education, the report identifies that FE, since the 1980s, has been subject to 28 major pieces of legislation, 6 different ministerial departments, 48 secretaries of state with relevant responsibilities, and that no agency in government has survived longer than a decade concerned with further education. Aside, I have to say, and I'm pleased that David's here, from the AOC and the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, the 2 representative organisations which government doesn't control. The extent of flux in FE is even more apparent when presented graphically in the report. I'm not asking you to look at this, I really am. It's meant to be impressionistic. It gives you an idea of the number of changes that have been applied to the sector and their complexity over that period. In looking for causes of such instability, they identify three main sources. First, in common with the other two case studies, a lack of policy memory and an unwillingness to re-examine past policy. Secondly, and specifically in relation to FE, the fact that it lacks a constituency amongst politicians and civil servants, who are unlikely themselves to experience FE as a student or as a parent of a student within FE. And most critically, for my thesis tonight, competing and often conflicting ideas about what the sector is for. These quotes sum up much of what's in the report, and the one I particularly like is the last one. In their comments on the report's conclusions, two government insiders, Rachel Wolfe, a special advisor to David Cameron, and Philip Collins, a speechwriter for Tony Blair, confirmed that the lack of consistent attention given to FE by wider government and the corresponding freedom for relatively junior ministers to initiate wide-ranging change in the sector, there being no clear philosophical model for a junior minister towards FE, which makes it easier for them to randomly tinker with the sector. And the tendency, critically, when funding is constrained, to grant FE a low priority. The last of these has been a consistent since 1926, when the recommendations for the draft regulations in relation to FE were shelved in the face of financial stringency. Likewise, the 1944 Act's proposal to establish technical schools to complement grammar schools and secondary moderns was lost to financial constraints in the late 1940s and 1950s. And clearly, the coalition cuts from 2010 to 2015 are a reflection of the same phenomenon. And here the comparison is made with universities. The school line would be between those two, but would be keeping pace with inflation, but not increasing during the same period. The vulnerability of FE to being last in line for funding is reinforced in the CONRES research, which questioned 20 senior civil servants from various departments on their attitudes towards further education. The questioning revealed the same lack of direct experience of FE as with politicians, and hence the same lack of intimate knowledge of what further education was. But it also reflected the difficulty of making a compelling case for further education in its totality due to the breadth of its provision and what one of the respondents called its amorphous nature. Interestingly, the only element of FE provision that was to benefit financially during the coalition years was apprenticeships, where a clear, relatively simple, and compelling story could be told that gained cross-party consensus. A number of the respondents also wished that FE colleges, in particular, could concentrate on what they were good at, without bothering to say precisely what that might be. So, if we move on from policymakers and policies to wider stakeholders, my sources here are a comprehensive report by the Learning and Skills Council in 2007 and a series of surveys and reports conducted by the AOC and the Department for Business during Colleges Weeks over a 4-year period. The LSE research and the AOC surveys came up with wider stakeholders, came up with a consistent, two conclusions that were very consistent. First, that the local reputation of further education colleges and further education, though a course variable, is generally much stronger locally than its reputation is nationally. Second, that the reputation of all forms of further education is overall stronger when respondents have had direct experience of that provision, either as a student, parent, or employer. In terms of local partners, local authorities and school partners were generally positive about colleges, but a number remarked on their highly competitive nature and their focus on marketing. A final important set of stakeholders, and here my impressions are anecdotal, but reinforced in the Institute for Government report, relates to the attitude of FE by journalists and the media. Most national journalists, but not all, because some of them have done their journalist courses in colleges, share the lack of direct experience of further education as a student or parent. Their most often cited complaint about further education is that it's too complicated to tell a clear story about, unless it's linked to individual students, which is a good thing, or scandals in particular institutions, or about a specific element of further education. At my time at the AOC, they also constantly bemoaned the lack of interest in stories about further education from their editors that they were trying to sell stories into. I discern some change in the last 2 years, which I hope is not a consequence of me having left the AOC and David doing a better job. But even then, the greater focus on what the sector does currently tends to be about specific elements of the sector, technical education, about apprenticeships, and those more defined issues rather than further education in general or further education providers as a group. And finally then to staff and leaders in further education. My primary source of reference in relation to the views of leaders in further education is a FETL funded piece of work by Gabriella Braun, who's here this evening, to make sure I don't misrepresent what she said. The report, and there are copies outside, is definitely worth wider attention. Gabriella and her colleagues at Working Well conducted a series of seminars in 2016 with a mixed group of independent training providers, chief execs, principals of colleges and chairs of colleges, against a backdrop of key psychoanalytical themes and systems theory, including attachment, presence, persecution, and aggression. Amongst the key conclusions from the seminars were observations as, again, the fragmentary nature of further education, but also the difficulty in identifying a primary task, picking up on Hershen's point here. The seminars also indicated high levels of stress and anxiety within the sector, and inherent problems with meaning and purpose, as well as the place of the sector within the wider education sector as a whole. Critically, for my thesis this evening, the seminars confirmed a lack of clarity about purpose and self-identity, as well as self-esteem. Additionally, while there was some strong disagreement around this point, a number of attendees discerned a sense of victimhood in the role of the sector as a bullied victim and as a rescuer of others. One of Gabriella's conclusions was particularly telling in this regard, I think. For the attitude of staff, both teaching and in support roles, my primary source has been work commissioned by the FE Reputation Steering Group in 2012, involving a wide-ranging literature review, one-to-one interviews, and a survey. When I saw the report in 2012 at the AOC, I was heartened by the evident commitment and loyalty of staff within further education and the job satisfaction they derived from making a difference. But key conclusions for my thesis this evening were that 71% of the staff, before they were employed in further education, had undertaken some form of educational training within the sector themselves. The adjectives most often used to describe the sector's reputation by the staff were poor, challenging, or second. And reputation was, again, seen to be stronger locally with engaged employers than it was nationally. To this, I would add a sense from the report of further education taking the hit for failings in policy nationally and underfunding nationally. And finally, in considering reputation and identity, a mention of heritage. In an excellent blog, my former colleague at the AOC, Ben Verida, who's here again tonight, has commented on the neglected heritage and history within colleges. He notes that many colleges have as richer and longer history as many universities, dating back well into the 19th century and predating the formation of metropolitan universities such as Manchester and Birmingham. Apprenticeship provision obviously has even deeper roots in the medieval guilds, but a look at college websites, in contrast to university websites, will find little or no reference to this important source of self-identity and continuity. Indeed, it seems more remembered in the communities in which the institutions are located than in the institutions themselves. In probably what's the most effective quantitative and qualitative research I've done since I've been at the IOE, on each occasion I've got off a train to take a taxi to go to a college, I've asked to be taken to the tech. On each and every occasion I've been taken to the correct location. people remember things longer than the institutions themselves. This long-term sense of roots seems to have been lost through the process of consolidation of those institutions and the aggregation of functions to further education. So if I come back to what I call my overall consequences here, a lack of sense of self and clear identity at national level that has the potential to undermine effective agency and influence. And although FE is better understood and more valued at the local level, there are nonetheless consequences from the national phenomenon in terms of underfunding, reacting to frequent policy changes, and a tendency not to think beyond the immediate. So, having diagnosed a problem, what might be the alternatives? So if it's poorly it's defined and understood, it has consequences, are there alternative ways of characterising it that provides a clearer sense of identity? An identity that encourages greater self-confidence and provides for more directional and differentiating sense of purpose. There have been several recent attempts to convey this sense of self and purpose. First, Dame Ruth, who's here, own powerful description of FE as an adaptive layer in the English education system, a layer that constantly evolves, it mutates in order to meet the needs of students, communities, employers. It's what its community needs it to be. I particularly like the phrases that she uses of the sector exhibiting both mutability and mutuality. Mutability and mutuality. This conception captures well, I think, what further education has become with the accretion of functions, or from another perspective, the imposition of duties, since the term was first used in 1917. But despite its value as an explanatory device, I think it has understandable limitations in predictive terms, or as one that secures distinctive and enduring purpose in the sector. Critically, also, I think it's of only limited utility in determining strategy in FE providers, or for policymakers informing policy in relation to FE in all of its forms. Two further recent attempts to convey a better understanding are also, I think, worth rehearsing. First, Baroness Margaret Sharp's conception of colleges being a dynamic nucleus at the heart of local communities. This conception builds upon Ruth's adaptive layer and is in a sense more active in driving change at the local level as well as reacting to change and new requirements. It is, though, specifically related to colleges only and does not cover the full gamut of further education and skills provision. Beyond Baroness Sharp's report, the most recent attempt to provide a coalescing narrative is Vince Cable's characterisation in 2015 of further education having a dual mandate. A dual mandate in providing vocational education for the workplace with a focus on higher and technical professional skills, but also in providing second chances for those who have not succeeded in their school system. This characterisation seemed to have been well received across the FE sector, but the consultation that it prompted was quietly shelved by the incoming government in 2015 for reasons that were never made public. But despite its warm reception, there is a potential problem too with this characterisation. In its duality between an aspiration to be the preferred location for technical and professional skills and to provide second chances. It's a good match for many in FE, how they see themselves, and particularly for the rescue mission, which Gabriella comments upon in her report. But combining that deeply felt rescue mission with being the first choice destination for higher level skills is more difficult to reconcile than might first be supposed. The tension was captured in a controversial way in the Lingfield report of 2012. The tension identified here also has significant implications for FE and how it markets itself. If it's to move beyond the conception in the CONRES and Institute for Government reports of FE being for other people's children, the rescue mission may not need to be to the fore, despite its evident value and importance. And as the quote implies, and as I shall argue in a moment, the dual mandate dilutes the focus that a clear and singular sense of purpose provides in crafting longer-lasting strategy at the institutional and provider level. I'm forced to the conclusion, therefore, that none of these alternatives and more extended definitions, despite adding some value, provides an antidote to the consequences of the prevailing and long-standing catch-all definition of FE that we started with, education not in a school or a university. If you're at this point expecting me to come up with an all-encompassing, yet directional and distinctive definition of further education that redresses all those consequences that I've described, then I'm going to disappoint you. Indeed, I think there may be value in dropping the term altogether, if you honestly ask me. But in the belief that this is unlikely to happen anytime soon, I think there are two approaches that might help in taking forward the debate. First, FE as a system, and seeing FE as a system. Further education is most often characterised as a sector, corresponding with the Wikipedia definition as embracing a range of providers that are neither schools nor universities. Or, from a content perspective, as comprising provision that's not academic, though as we see, many FE colleges deliver academic qualifications as well as vocational qualifications. The alternative could be to see FE as a system, as the Foster report suggested in 2005. But the word system implies some sense of order and coherence. It's hard to see further education, as I've described it this evening, as a bounded, designed, and coherent system. I think Gabriella's description of it being like a dysfunctional family is closer to the mark. But seeing further education as a system of systems instead, not a single system, a system of systems, sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting, and sometimes reinforcing, does, I think, begin to get closer to the mark. It would enable us to think of the constituent parts of the system of systems, adult and community learning, technical and professional education, work-based learning, and so on, separately and distinctively. For instance, this week, I don't know if Mark is here, Mark Doel, the Chief Executive of the Association of Education or Employment and Learning Providers, made the point that the Further Education Commissioner, who's also here this evening, is no such thing. He's the Commissioner for Further Education Colleges, not for all further education. And the term begins to use, and thinking it that way begins to give us some thought about the distinctive role that colleges have as anchor institutions in their place with a different set of responsibilities and duties that require an FE Commissioner to support and guide or assist. Thinking in this way would also allow for those differing interests to be expressed by representative bodies within a system of systems, and also for alliances to be struck when interests coincide. A more distinct set of propositions could be put then on behalf of all types of colleges, independent training providers and charitable providers, and an identity established in the mind of policymakers and the public, rather than being wrapped up in the catch-all of further education. But even the system of systems methodology has something of a mechanical feel to it. And it doesn't sit easily, I think, with the complexity of the landscape that is further education as the adaptive layer of education. A further alternative that has been actively pursued here by colleagues in the Post-14 Centre for Education and Work is to use the metaphor of an ecosystem, building upon the work of David Feingold and others relating to high skills ecosystems. Seeing further education in all its guises as part of a wider social ecosystem that is constantly changing and mutating does, I think, accord much more accurately with the fluidity, ambiguity, and mutuality that applies to further education providers of all kinds. The ecosystem metaphor embraces the relationships and interdependencies that further education providers have at the local, the regional, the national, and sectoral levels. And it's in that ecosystem context that I actually, after all this time, come to my punchline, which is that, as I proposed at the start, that in the absence of an embracing, differentiating, and directive definition, individual further education providers should give greater and more conscious attention to their own distinctive purpose, identity, and contribution to the ecosystem within which they sit. And that's what I'm calling self-determination. In coming to that conclusion, I'm drawing upon a range of influences from Lorenz on complexity and non-linearity, Clausewitz, and Jay's here. I have mentioned Clausewitz, probably the first time in a public lecture at the Institute of Education and the last time for many years. On Clausewitz, particularly relevant on the need in the face of uncertainty to focus, to make progress. And business thinkers like Rumelt and Sinek, and economists like John Kay and Ken Binmore, so from a range of sources. What I say here might at first appear most applicable to colleges, but I've tested and adjusted my thinking through conversations with a number of chief executives of independent training providers, most notably Alan Cave of APM, a large ITP based in the Midlands. Lorenz's analysis of complex systems and uncertainty, and there can be few social systems that are more complex and subject to more uncertainty than further education, emphasizes the importance of the initial action, the first step, and the difficulty after that first step of maintaining a sense of consistent direction in the face of constantly changing circumstances. Meanwhile, military theory, the father of which actually is, much of which is Clausewitz, emphasizes the need to focus effort to make progress in conditions of extreme uncertainty, unpredictability, and stress. The first principle of war in British military doctrine is selection and maintenance of the aim, a prescription that's shared in pretty much every staff college, military staff college across the world. Meanwhile, in the world of business, Richard Rummel of UCLA, on the basis of interviews and analysis of a wide range of businesses, both public and private, concludes that the difference between good and bad strategy is most essentially that good strategy says as much about what will not be done as what will be done. Bringing this closer to home, the Charity Governance Code, upon which the AOC's Code of Governance is largely based, identifies the first duty of a trustee as being to define and safeguard organisational purpose. But if that organisational purpose is so widely and imprecisely drawn, the focus that Clausewitz and Rummel require is denied, and the challenges identified by Lorenz are amplified. As an illustration, I'd ask you to look at this random collection of mission statements taken from further education college websites and ask yourself how much sense of direction and focus that they convey and what they say about the college does and what it does not do. Lest I be accused of seeing this weakness as being restricted to further education, this is a mission statement for Cornell University, and this is Rummel's view of that statement. For reasons of discretion and keeping my job, I've not looked at the UCL mission statement before I came out this evening. Nor is this issue limited to education. A quick look at Carillion's website before it was taken down demonstrates a similarly open-ended mission, which conveys little sense of direction, or of a distinct range of capabilities, competencies, or focus. They may well have been better advised to read the most recent annual letter to CEOs from Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, the world's largest investment house, which was entitled A Sense of Purpose. The lack of what might be called connective tissue in large service companies like Carillion, who end up carrying out tasks as varied as preparing school meals, running prisons, maintaining hospitals, and building train lines, could, I think, be compared to the accretion of functions under the banner of further education, sometimes with similarly small amounts of stretched connective tissue. The alternative is to define more carefully what I'm calling core purpose. This need not be all that a company or a college does, but it's at the core of its being. Other tasks might be taken on from time to time, but in echo of the comment from the Lingfield report, these might be best seen as contingent tasks. These contingent tasks taken on as capacity, opportunity, and cost allows and need, consistent with but not at the core of the organisation's business. Consistent but not at the core. Identifying and safeguarding this core purpose is not easy work, but it is, I think, the first and foremost task of governing bodies of colleges and of non-execs of companies seeking a sustainable future and seeking to build strategies that extend beyond the next year or the next 2 years. I resist saying what I think the core purpose of colleges or of other types of organisations should be in further education, because I think that would be presumptuous on my part. And in any case, it would also forestall what I think is the most under-realised promise of incorporation in 1992, the exercise of autonomy through the self-determination of purpose. So the exercise of autonomy through the self-determination of purpose. It would also neglect the fact that purpose needs to be contextualised in every case. But I do think that in teasing out that purpose, the use of three of Kipling's wise men might be helpful. Governing bodies and leaders of independent training providers could ask questions like, who do I serve? Why am I best placed to do this? And what is my distinctive contribution within the ecosystem? Once defined in this way, core purpose is not immutable and it's not set for all time, but it needs to be reasonably enduring. And any move away from that purpose should be deliberate and considered, not the product of unrecognised drift. Conceived in this way, core purpose has the potential for colleges and providers to more easily convey a clear identity that does not require personal experience of a college or of that training provider. Provide for a focus in planning and enabling strategies that extend beyond 2 to 3 years. Establish trust amongst other actors in complex ecosystems, with points of collaboration and complementarity as well as competitions being more clearly defined, and enables providers to navigate their way through the constant fluctuations in policy affecting further education, evaluating those that correspond with their purpose and capacities, rather than simply responding to each new funding opportunity or direction, and not to be blown every which way by the changing winds of policy, what Frank Koffold has called transient policy. When combined with an examination of values, I think that this greater and more defined sense of identity would also underwrite more successful mergers and acquisitions, and to underwrite a greater degree of specialisation between providers. But in mentioning values, I think that many in further education will place this above a dry definition of purpose in their thinking. The sector is what I would call a value-rich environment. I do not deny the importance of setting and identifying values, but I think that they succeed and underwrite purpose rather than precede and determine purpose. Moreover, whilst I think that defining purpose begins with the leadership of the organisation, most particularly the governing body or the board, values are built with all in the organisation, enabling them to become lived behaviours, providing a moral compass. They have a role to play in determining what might be done, but a much greater impact on how things will be done. As an example, and I'm slightly nervous here because one of my co-authors of this document is in the audience, the core values of and ethos of the Royal Air Force, which I had a role in writing, were not codified until 2006, some 88 years after the Royal Air Force was formed, and 88 years after that purpose of the Royal Air Force was defined by Smuts, Trenchard, and the new Air Force Board. The values were lived and felt values that fitted the organisation before they were codified. Predominantly, they were codified also for new recruits. There are only 4 values also in that core value and ethos in the Royal Air Force, and each of them distinctive to the Royal Air Force. Just as in purpose, I'm sometimes bemused by the long list of values adopted by organisations in further education and also in universities. Each of these values is hard to disagree with, but not necessarily distinctive. They're also sometimes such a long list, aimed at not excluding anyone, that they're impossible to remember, let alone live. Nonetheless, I've combined purpose and values in this graphic with the third element, vision, in what might be called the unholy trinity of management speak that you get on every website, to illustrate much of what I've been saying tonight. The first arrow, the first condition, if it's not, in Lorenz's term, sure and with a real sense of focus, will lead to greater confusion and uncertainty later. But uncertainty enters the equation always with changing requirements. That's not a problem. If there are bounded direction of travel, there's a bounded direction of travel by purpose, particularly, but also values and ethics. Progress continues to be made because a sense of purpose is maintained. It doesn't matter, there are many different ways to move forward, but what begins to present difficulty is when we move outside that core purpose. The organisation either makes no progress or becomes, by stages, a different organisation without anyone recognising what it's become. So, in concluding remarks, what I've attempted tonight to do is track the evolution of the term further education, point to the consequences of the indistinct and all-embracing character of that definition in terms of policy formation, resource allocation, and the development of a secure identity amongst FE providers. I've also pointed to the benefits of seeing FE as a system of systems, or even better, a part of a constantly evolving ecosystem. And most importantly for me, that providers, FE providers of all kinds, and specifically their leadership, need to give closer attention to their core purpose as a means of navigating forward in a more sure-footed and long-sighted way. In closing, I think this quote from John Kay, the economist, might be a good prompt. If we're looking to build a sustainable future in further education in its many forms, making a profit is not the purpose of an independent training provider. Getting bigger is not the core purpose of a college. And surviving is not the core purpose of a college or an independent training provider. A core purpose defines why you are doing these things. It provides a sense of identity and some greater ownership of an organisation's destiny. Thank you.
Congratulations, Martin. That was an absolute tour de force. And, these questions of distinctiveness and purpose are absolutely fundamental for leadership, aren't they? So I'm sure that the audience are going to have a lot of questions about that. I was also struck by your frequent reference to the sort of issues around social capital in the system and so forth. I fancy myself a bit of a poster girl for social capital in FE because I myself attended Bath Tech in the late 1980s and was taught by a charismatic young sociology teacher called Dave James, who is now Professor David James and has become chair of the education panel for the next research assessment framework exercise. So we exemplified some good social capital there, I think, at least. We turn now, I'm delighted really to welcome Ruth to give the response. Now, Dame Ruth Silver really needs no introduction, of course, to an audience like this. She's a towering figure within the further education sector, typically instigator and always there at the start, a founding president of FETL, and before that, chair of both the Learning and Skills Improvement Service Board and elected council. She was a founding member of the London Skills and Employment Board, a founding trustee of the Edge Foundation, and was the first chief assessor for the qualifying programme for principals too. She's chaired numerous task forces and commissions in the UK and currently co-chairs the Skills Commission. Alongside, she was, for 17 years, the principal of Lewisham College. How did you achieve all this? It's amazing. Chiming with the arguments in Martin's lecture, an Ofsted inspection report described Lewisham College as skillful in aligning its provision to current learner and economic needs. So I think that says it all. Ruth will now present a brief response to Martin's lecture before we move on to the Q&A. Ruth.
I'm so knackered by all the things that she listed that I needed help getting onto the platform. I'm delighted to be here, colleagues, for this, for FETL and as well as for Martin, this very important phase. It's most significant, and I think we all realise it is the first of its kind. hopefully it's not going to be the last. I just want to say a couple of things, because I knew a bit about what Martin was going to say, and he said a lot more than he said he would, and I'll get him for that later. But I think I now understand why I differ from Martin more clearly than ever before, because I agree with him on so much of what he said. But actually, let me declare myself. It's helpful to me as well. I work within I surf a different paradigm from Martin. And I think this is new learning for me, which is actually the paradigm I work with is one about learning and not managing an organisation. And we do exactly the same tasks, and I know that Martin does a lot about learning as well, but actually, if we're looking for distinctiveness, I think that's where I surf, and it's what I want to place side by side with the knowledge and the comments from Martin this evening. I think it takes you to different places, even though they sound the same. I think they're different. So, a couple of things. I've come here tonight not to argue with Martin. We do plenty of that, actually, and we learn a lot from one another. Nor do I come here to be an assessor, though I'm very badly tempted. When you've marked things all your life, you get into the habit of that. So really my intention in responding is to amplify a bit of what Martin's been saying from the perspectives and the roles that I have taken up already. But I do want to say it's an important moment, and I want to congratulate Martin. I think that's a very, very strong contribution to helping us clarify how we can be useful in the future and write some scripts for it. That's really the intention. As I said, I'm not come here to mark you or to supervise you, but really as a colleague to try and open up the conversation to everybody else. But let me start by a word. This is Martin's phrase: a word from the sponsor. Actually, Further Education Trust for Leadership is 4 years old. It was set up to take up a space to deal with four things. Further education in England is under-researched, under-conceptualised, under-theorised and under-understood. And we wanted to breed that kind of thinking mindset. And when we talk to colleagues, what they said is we want time to think. We are rushing from one change to another. So you can see us going forward as actually being to deal with that desire that came from the sector, knowing that they need more than what they were doing. And delighted to have appointed the first Professor Martin is it, and it's terrific to have him on board and to challenge us as well. So, I'm just trying to think how to zone in Martin, because you and I believe certain things. Okay, so FETL itself works with a concept, and Martin made me bring some books which actually explores the concept. So this notion that further education is the adaptive layer in the education system in England is an important one for us. It's dependent on systems thinking and so on. But actually it's much more important than that. It identifies the reason why we are the adaptive layer, important to FETL, and that's simply because schools are compulsory and protected by the law, and universities are selective and protected by the Queen. They have royal charters, as you probably all know. And there's nobody there takes that place of authority and stewardship and agency for further education. I actually happen to think that's great fun and it's a strength. But you do have to realise that we are the only place that governments can turn to when social life changes. And I have some examples I want to kind of call in that. So if you get why we are the adaptive layer, you can see the rigidity of the other two systems to which we don't belong, as Martin quite rightly says. Now, I have a habit which I want to share with you and see if I can stick to it. I have four questions for listening, reading and viewing when I am involved in anything really. And they are, do I know this already? Do I agree with what's being said, what's known? What did I not know before I encountered this? And what more do I want to know about? And that's what guided me in my earlier discussions with Martin and earlier readings of the parts of the paper he showed me. He's obviously been working very hard since the last time we talked about it. And I liked very much, Martin, the structure of history and heritage, the issue of definition and defining as a process, the analysis of consequences, and whether FE is a system or not a system. And I'll come back to those later. So what did I already know when I listened to you and when I read your paper? Actually, mostly a lot. That's not surprising, really, because I've been around a long time. But I hadn't known it in the way where you have very clearly connected all of that for us. And actually, the familiarity of the detail, I think, is a way of kind of misunderstanding how complex that's all been. The depth and the width of flux I knew about, but actually your numerical data says so much about the texture of that it's really very helpful to see what it means when you are adaptive, and really gives some insight, I think, into the sector's sense of identity and confidence. And all of that is terrifically helpful as we think about what to do next and what to do about the issues you've identified. Second question, did I know that already? What was it I didn't know? And actually the truth is not too much I didn't know about. I mean, after all, I was there for a lot of that time, and I was causing some of those turbulences. But actually what I didn't know about is really the way you have shaped the relatedness of all those bits to one another. So we've been known as part of those. But your focus is on defining and strategy, and I think that's maybe where mine comes into difference. You remind me of the width and depth of all that has been done to us and all that we've been expected to do over that length of time. And again, your data picture points to further study. I think actually I see your whole lecture as pointing the way ahead to further study, actually for all of us, and hopefully for you, Martin. Now, do I agree with what you're saying? Well, actually, mostly the facts are indisputable. I know you have been diligent about and thorough in the work that you've done in all of this. But I don't always, and have not always agreed with your analysis and the process you used. But having listened to you this evening, I understand that to be because I surf a different paradigm. So things that I thought might be really problematic between you and I aren't actually, because I come from, wouldn't I? My background is a clinical psychologist working with young people, teaching literature as well as other things, takes that as my starting point. And I don't want to leave that starting point because I think that's been the strength of all the work I've been involved in. I wanted to know more about definitions and the art of defining things. And I did a wee bit of research myself, and I discover there's two types of definitions in the world. And this really helps me stay closely aligned to Martin. The first one is an intentional definition. And that definition deals with the essence of the term. And I think that's maybe part of my paradigm. And the extensional definition lists the objects described in what's being talked about. Actually, your paper has both of those. And I think that I rest, because I really believe in management, I rest reminding myself to think about which works best. And maybe they're not separate, maybe they are just extensions. But I was very helped with that notion that we don't disagree, that we just define differently because we define the purpose, the primary purpose, as different. But I do have different thoughts, I think, about is FE a system. I think FE is a system, and it's a system that sits within an ecosystem. I'm part of the research project at the Royal Society on this, so I've seen all the big drawings, and they're really impressive, and actually persuasive as well. But the difference I think I would take from you is actually that FE is a system with subsystems. To separate out adult education from 14 to 16 vocational education, especially now with the diversity of the types of schools around, I don't find it helpful. So my line is actually that FE in skills is a system of subsystems, related connected subsystems with the same DNA, and it's within the system, the ecosystem of education. And I'm happy to discuss that further because I need to learn more about it. I want to mention two things that I think don't come up enough in our thinking and maybe even in your discussion, but I mention them in the knowledge that you will chase them further. Two important factors to be taken into account in anything about systems thinking is the environment in which the system is placed. And actually what you talked about, for me, was the very big changes in the environment that we faced pre-war, post-war, economically and socially. And I think that's one of my true starting points. And something I've learned to care about a lot is the intention of the system you're talking about. If the intention of the system is management or strategy or whatever, then of course you'll think differently from if the intention is different. And that's where the judgment lies. And I think I learned a long time ago to talk about the intentionality of the system under scrutiny and under discussion, because systems are designed to do particular things. And sometimes they do the wrong things, but actually that intention has to be explicit. I'm really coming back. So in terms of what's ahead, I'm urging you, Martin, and everybody else that I know about, to devise a wider genealogy of what this sector has been through, relating that to environment, to authorities, and so on. The political masters need to be looked at, social context, and so on. But and to bear in mind one thing. If I give you an agenda, ahoy, it would be something like the genealogy of the governments. Further education and skills is about class. And unless you get the politics of that, then it's very easy to misunderstand. It's also about the geography of governance. Who do you think you're serving when your local college is working in Delhi? And the gathering of our own folks into this institution so that your thinking is well-fed, well-nourished by the practice of the leaders in the sector as it changes. And to develop it even further, let's get a language that can be shared and learn how to talk so folks will listen, and listen so folks will talk to us. I want to say, last thing, Becky, if you don't mind. We're not underfunded because we don't have a clearly defined purpose. If we had a clearer purpose, would that bring more money through our doors? I don't think so. We're underfunded because we're the only place where government can turn to. We work on one-year budgets. Of course, it's easy to cut a one-year budget than it is a three-year budget. You have the authority for that. And I have a real question about actually the status and dignity of the sector. And these are really all comments to support your further thinking. Why is it different in Scotland, where actually young people who fail in school don't go to college for remediation, they stay in school till they get it right? And colleges are places of high stature that lead through from basic level vocational education and training right through to graduation. Now, the intentions of the system. Let me remind you what's happened to vocational education and training. In the 70s, people came through our doors funded by government to deal with youth unemployment in society. That's the environment, that's the intention of the system. In the 80s and 90s, they came to colleges because employers, the government funded what it funded because employers were complaining that we were failing them. And now with a similar agenda on vocational education and training, we are being asked by the government to deal with the nation's concerns about the future of employment. They had better intentions, actually, and they should be better for us. So I leave you with a question, actually. If a clearer definition would be funded better, I think we need to do more than an exploration of intentions in order for that to happen. But the paradigm I'm most comfortable with as I stand and look out in the world is about learning first, and then the rest, I think, holds the purpose that you talk so clearly about.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you very much. Well, I think, I'm really struck actually by those thoughts, the responses. And obviously we've had some allusions to social capital, to class. I'm really intrigued actually that we haven't really touched much on yet in either talks about the nature of the curriculum. And really, a question from me would be, how much is this lack of definition or being defined in terms of what it's not, yet again, coming back to this issue about the academic vocational divide in England. But rather than abuse my position of chair, because we're a little bit over time, I'm going to turn straight to the audience and we'll see if some of those themes come through. So I'll take a collection of questions all at once. I think, do we have a roving mic? We've got one here right at the front, one on my right-hand side, and another, the gentleman in the jacket. sorry, up at the very front first, please, with the so the gentleman in the green jumper. If you can start by saying who you are and where you're from.
I'm Jed, I'm from Haven College. The digital revolution is dwarfing the industrial revolution. We're changing from an agrarian society, 90% of the population working on the land, to a 10% working on the land and 9% living in cities. The digital revolution is enormous. And most of the development of new software systems is done in an agile way of thinking. So it's not about identifying the outcome like we're building a building, but actually thinking, well, we'll model through to get something that works rather than defining what will be at the end of that process. Is defining the FE sector in some ways counterproductive?
Very interesting question, thank you. And we'll go straight to the gentleman in the blue jacket behind.
Good evening, Paul Little from Scotland, from the City of Glasgow College. Can I first of all congratulate FETL for sponsoring this? I think college education is much under-researched, and indeed in Scotland we don't use the term FE, so I would agree with you, Martin. I think you should drop it. In fact, we're moving to an area of tertiary education in Scotland. So my question, I suppose, is really a two-part question. One, the importance of diversity in college education. In the system that you describe, how important is that diversity within that system? And the second part is looking at the macro system, because it's nice to hear the references about FE in England, but there are 4 nations in the United Kingdom. So my analysis, and we've talked about this before, is that the Celtic nations are diverging. Sorry, the Celtic nations are converging, but the English nation is diverging. Would you agree with that?
Thank you very much. And Sidley.
Hi, my name's Sam Perrett. I'm the Chief Executive of London South East Colleges, and I was really interested and I think welcomed all of your comments, and I was particularly interested that neither of you talked about failure, systems failure in particular, and I just wonder, taking you back through that analysis, Martin, really, particularly, you know, post-92 policy analysis, there is a really strong discourse around failure, systems failure, failing to meet the needs of employers, failing to deliver this on the skills gap, failing to meet the needs of 14 to 16-year-olds, English and maths students. And I just wonder where you see that critical discourse takes us, really, I think, in terms of how we define our sector.
Thank you very much. Really stimulating questions. So over to you, Martin, to start with. We started with the question about the future and the digital revolution.
For the first question, I think it's a great question. And I can combine it with yours, Becky, the challenge around the curriculum. If I was defining the purpose of a college like Havering College, and I kind of hesitate to do so, I think I'd be characterising it as providing technical or professional education to meet the needs of employers, students and communities within which they're located. Those needs change frequently, and the college needs to change with them. That doesn't mean to say the core purpose of the college has changed. It's how it performs and delivers against that purpose. And in a related way, Becky, addressing it, I think it to some degree takes up the challenge from Ruth around class. The current reform to technical education, I think, is particularly critical. But it will fail if it doesn't begin to identify how the curriculum for technical education differs from that from academic education, or the blended education of both technical and professional, or technical and academic in general applied. We need to be thinking about what marks technical education as different, where the content is derived from, who's best placed to deliver it, what the requirements of the institutions that are going to deliver it, how it's going to be taught, and how it's going to be assessed. If we think about it as distinctive and different, then we'll begin to talk about it being of equal status, difference. Well, I don't know, the comparative extreme, I hate it, but it will be regarded as not being class related. Academic education is associated with higher class, vocational education is associated with lower class. So I think we need to think about whatever the new requirements of a technical education are, and the colleges need to match and respond to those. So the digital revolution is only one revolution. The core purpose remains the same. Paul, I think we absolutely agree here. And if I'd had more time this evening, I would have gone on to the benefits of differentiation, which is what I was talking about within ecosystems, about people being respected and regarded for what they provide distinctively. And in Scotland, there are things that I would disagree with in terms of what has been done. And I do agree that the Celtic nations are diverging from what's going on in England and the marketised system that we have here. And the more distinctive roles enjoyed by colleges is a strength within Scotland. So seeing a distinctive college sector, I think, is a strength, and one we've lost within England through the marketised situation that we're in and the almost vanilla-like character of a number of institutions here. And Sam, in terms of systems failure, my greatest kind of objection is that the institutions within the system most often get blamed for the system's failure rather than the failure of policy. In my association with policy, going back beyond the 8 years of the AOC, policy always fails. Policy is incapable of being successful precisely, so it's always in a state of consistent failure. But some institutions seem to be able to rise above that, or some parts, institutions in society generally seem to escape association with the failure of the system. And universities, for good or ill, like Oxford and Cambridge, seem to just skate above and beyond all of this. Now, I don't know if I've reached towards an answer in this tonight, and I absolutely agree, Ruth, for instance, that funding that is not the only, the lack of identity and agency is not the only source of lack of funding within further education, but I think it's a contributing factor, and confidence within what the sector provides and what provision it makes and how vital that is sometimes underrepresented. So yes, I think it's always going to fail, but we need to try and rise above and beyond the failure of the system and the policy.
Ruth, did you want to come in at all?
I do. I think I want to locate failure somewhere else, as well as the systems that we've talked about. I think there's a lie in society about authority. So Martin calls quite rightly for self-definition and so on. But we used to have a colleague principal in South London, Bill Bailey knows him, because Bill Bailey knows everything about FE in its past. And he would say we have as much choice in running our colleges as a Marks and Spencer's provider. We have to do the courses government will fund. We have to do them within the ratios of staff and students and so on. And I think that's what I'd like to take the skin away from a bit more. You are, leadership and authority, but actually we're funded by government on a yearly basis, and that's a very quick way of making us change what we deliver. I agree with Martin, it doesn't change, never change the purpose in the colleges I know, and the well-led colleges. So that's one of the kind of failures, is that real honesty about the subsidiarity of that relationship. I think the other failure as well is something about our relatedness to other parts. So there's something about, as my daughter would say, getting over ourselves and really seeing ourselves in relatedness to the rest of the system, I think, is the only way to go forward. So there's something about, I remember actually a few ministers have said the difference between principals and principals, they said principals and head teachers, is head teachers only talk about learning obsessively, and principals very rarely mention it. They talk about funding regimes and so on, and curriculum change. So I think we need to kind of stand back a wee bit and say, okay, so what could we be better at? Where's room for improvement in the leadership of the sector?
It's really helpful, thank you. We've probably got time for one more round of questions. So if we can keep probably the questions quick and the answers quick, we'll get more in. So we've got a gentleman over here. Any others on this side, perhaps? Yes, one in the corner. Please.
Oh, hello. Simon Kelleher, Head of Education and Skills at Policy Connect. I was listening to what you were saying, Martin, and you mentioned Carillion at one point, and I was thinking about some of the large college groups which might have lots of subsidiaries and do lots of activities and work across the country. And I wanted to ask about your sense of, or your understanding of coherence in terms of mission, sense and purpose. Where does this limit the scope of activities and the scale of a provider? And if so, where that might leave those larger groups?
Thank you. And over in this corner.
Hello, Arinola from Westminster Adult Education Service. I'm the head of service and principal there, so based within a local authority. Devolution is one that we are all sort of trying to come to grips with. What are the panel's view in terms of whether that will further fragment the sector and how we actually define ourselves, given that the changes that are forthcoming with that will be quite, significant and will impact in a way that we've not seen previously?
Martin.
So, quick answers. Simon, what a great question, and not enough time to address the issue of groups, but if I do look to the Carillion example, I think if I was building a group around a college or a larger college, I'd be giving attention to what I said in the presentation of connective tissue. How is this new acquisition consistent with my core purpose? How is it going to build? Or if it's not consistent, how am I going to revise the whole core purpose of the organisation? Unless something binds it together and holds it together, and there's some sense of identity, you become a disparate service-type company, and there are a large number of them now, who eventually grow so large and so disparate, it's hard to understand what they're for or what they do, and actually they're very hard to control in any even or proper manner. They have huge management strategies, they have huge tomes on values, but no one takes any notice of them. They become they do become amorphous, and I fear that some colleges and colleges groups could become the same. They don't need to, but I think that needs to be given real attention when you're going into a merger or an acquisition situation. And on devolution, I won't give a long answer because I've been trying not to. I actually think local authorities have something to do here to understand how they now work with institutions that have become used to being autonomous as they become back closer to working with the local authorities. If local authorities, I think, try to turn the clock back to pre-incorporation and to closely control what colleges do, it's going to be a car crash. I think local authorities need to think through how they facilitate, guide, assist, and colleges, for their part, need to open themselves up to a better conversation with their local authorities and see themselves as partners to delivery in place in a way that they perhaps have forgotten to do in some cases since 1992. But if we're going to go back to the detailed control of colleges in a modern economy that's fast changing with the digital revolution and all else, I think we'll always just be slightly behind what's needed rather than anticipating what's needed and moving forward quickly.
Thank you, Martin. Ruth, would you like to comment?
I'll pick up on the devolution, which is the very opposite of the great big colleges, in a way. Actually, once upon a time, we were not a sector. We were part of local authorities. We were a subsystem within a local authority, within an overall system in the local authority. And I have a different view of incorporation. But let me talk about devolution. It is full of promise. The promise to belong, to use resources well, to do things on a wider basis than just institution, I think is worth thinking about and probably worth fighting for. But Martin's right. One of the reasons I think you have to be reasons to be careful and reasons to be cheerful, to be careful. Lewisham College once got money from the government to do its new roof and the Breakspears building. And then Millwall football team came along and the local authority wired the money to the local football team. And those things happened. Now, that's fine. Let's learn the lessons and set those lessons up as a set of protocols. There's nothing in the world harder than partnership. It's at least partnership when you are in that kind of subsidiary relationship. So I think it's terrific. We're funding a project right now with the RSA on learning cities, and it's full of the most amazing promise. But the arguments will come later and no doubt be painful. But I think it's promising.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, I think that's been a hugely stimulating, the talks and then the discussion. I know that many of you will be sitting there with further questions, and you'll get a chance to discuss together and with our speakers over a drink at our wine reception in a second. I just want to share again my thanks and gratitude to both our speakers this evening, and of course to FETL, we have Becky sitting here too, for this really productive partnership with the IOE that allows a platform for these debates. So important for the sector, for us at the IOE, to really nurture this stimulation and really being at the heart of debates on FE, or perhaps I should be talking about colleges. We'll carry on that debate over a drink in a minute as well. But first of all, can I just ask you to share with me in thanking our speakers?